So for the past month, Clarence Media has been extensively covering the Clarence Valley Council election. It's been one hell of an election, a different one from what we're used to seeing. Joining me today is another man who's been covering the election, former Deputy Mayor of the Clarence Valley, Craig Howe. He was Deputy Mayor from 2010, or most of the period from 2010 to 2016. And when he caught wind that there wasn't a lot of Meet the Candidates happening, he decided to start a Facebook page, Clarence Valley Meet the Candidates. That was before we announced that we did hold a Meet the Candidates in Grafton, but it's certainly helped to building conversation and giving the councillors a voice heading into the election. So I guess, Craig, just tell us a bit of background as to why you did create that page. Yeah,
well, I think you pretty much covered it. It was something like when I've run in various elections, state election and council elections, it's always been hard as a new guy and an independent to get your name out there and get your ideas and your profile out there. And I kind of thought, well, there's a lot of new candidates and there's not a lot of information, and people were talking about the lack of information on Facebook. So I thought, well, why not? It's not hard to do. You set it up and it essentially runs itself as long as people behave themselves, which they sort of did.
Yeah. So how was the response from firstly the candidates themselves and also the social media community?
Yeah, well, the candidates were pretty good. We didn't get all of them, obviously, but I did invite all of the ones that had social media. I mean, the way they choose to engage with the community is up to them. It's not something that we can, demand or expect. But I think the ones that were on there, I think, certainly gained some traction out of it, particularly the new ones. I mean, a lot of them have polled well. Certainly won't take any credit for their polling, but I think it helped because they were able to get their name and their face and their voice out there. So they were pretty accommodating, and being a busy time of year for them, I think they did a pretty good job of answering most of the questions. We tried to trickle them at them a little bit rather than bombarding them, but they usually seemed they had set times at night. They'd come on and they'd answer 4 or 5 questions at once, and then we wouldn't see them for a week. But they got the job done, and the people on the group themselves were all pretty good. The questions were all reasonably sensible. There's always going to be some out there ones, but they're still questions, and they're still worth an airing. Whether I agree with the questions or not wasn't really the point. It was what they wanted to ask, whether it was relevant to local government or not, and the councillors, or the candidates, decided which ones they would answer and which ones they sort of decided not to because they were a little bit kind of not in their bailiwick, which is fair enough. And I think it went quite well all up.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. So the particular topics that you felt that were particularly engaging or got a particular reaction this time around?
Look, it flipped and changed a bit. I think transparency's been a big thing, but I think that's been a big thing for a couple of years, not just coming into the election. I think that was one of the big ticket items that continued to come up regardless of what the question was asked. There was a lot of things around what are you going to do to make council more accountable to the people and more transparent to the people. That's standard for, I think, the way people think about government in general now. Interestingly, rates, I asked a rates question, the candidates answered it, but didn't get a lot of traction because I think that time's probably passed.
That's locked in now.
Yeah, the SRV thing's over and no one has any mind or intention to bring that back up again. So I think that didn't really come into the election. So it was really more about getting to know the candidates, I think, and the environment obviously was
given
big.
That only 4 of the existing candidates stood for re-election, a lot of new faces.
Yeah, heaps of new faces, and like I said, the environmental stuff was fairly large. It was probably the biggest in terms of number of questions. I guess there was a few that I didn't put through to the page because they were the same as questions that were asked previously, but they kept repeating. So that showed that people were interested in, not necessarily not developing. They just wanted to know how.
No mining and things like that.
Yeah, mining was big. It was also about DA processes and how are you going to guarantee that the DAs don't happen, but how do they look after the environment in the process? So they're pretty sensible questions, and I think they were well answered by the candidates as well, and they were pretty honest about it too, I think.
I guess on the transparency thing, there is of the candidates look like they're going to be on. I guess you've got Tiley, Day, Smith, and Clancy. From the top of my head, they all really would be suggesting reform. That's a pretty big word to throw at a council. Do you think there's any chance of a major shake-up happening with this new council?
It depends what they mean by reform, really, Bill. I mean, they say reform a lot, and I've heard reform a lot, but I haven't heard anyone say what reform they actually need. I mean, some say there's a reform needed within the staff of council. Councils don't have a lot of control over that. They can control who's the general manager, and obviously they'll need to employ one at some point in the next 3 years. 3.5 years, however long they're in for.
2.5.
2.5, is it?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's not a very long time. So I'm assuming they'll have to do it. They can't have an acting general manager for 2 years, I wouldn't think, but they might. I don't know. But that's really, in terms of reform of that, the other things they can do around staff is only create policy. Change existing policy, change how the staff interact with ratepayers from a policy perspective. But they can't actually direct staff what to do. So and that becomes the general manager's job to then enforce that. But I'm not sure what other reform. I'm waiting to hear. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what reform. There probably is something needed. Yeah. But what it is and what form it takes, that'll be interesting. Greg's probably along the lines of more along the environment, I'd suggest, being the one candidate, I guess, that did run on a party platform, and he's never shied away from that. I think he gets a fair bit of respect from me and a lot of people. Whether you agree with some of his philosophies or not, at least he's standing up and saying, this is what I am, and this is what I stand for, and this is what I want to do, and that's pretty impressive. The reform will be interesting from those guys, because Ian's obviously been away for a while, so I think his experience is fantastic, but I still think he's going to have a little bit of homework to do to find out what reform is necessary, unless he's going to take someone else's word for it. I don't think Ian's that kind of guy. I think he'll do his own research.
Yeah, all right. I guess talking about those two, Clancy and Tiley, obviously Tiley, there's been no secret there that he'd like to come in and become the mayor. Clancy has publicly said he'd like to be deputy, and do you get the same impression that from the existing candidates he possibly has that support as well?
It's hard to tell. I guess the mayoral election's a funny thing. I'm a supporter of a popularly elected mayor myself, and I guess one of the reasons for that is because I've been through the argy-bargy and the politicking that goes on behind the scenes in a mayoral race when there is actually a mayoral race. I'm not sure that Greg has, because I don't think there was too much of a mayoral race in the last 5.5 years. But there will be this time. It looks like it all depends who puts their hand up. But he's certainly got the runs on the board as inexperienced. And looking at Greg's how to vote card, I'd suggest he'll probably be the one who's running, not with them, because you don't do that, but they're sort of the mayor, deputy mayor ticket, if you want to put it. That's just an opinion. But Greg's how to vote card only had Steve Pickering at 2, then it had Ian Tiley and Bill Day. So that, I think, tells a bit of a story. I guess it depends who else puts their hand up. Deb Novak's been very non-committal about whether she's going to do it or not. I think she might be waiting to see where the tea leaves fall. Karen Thompson said she'll run, but I'm not sure that the way she polled will help her very much in the council chambers in the mayoral election. She'll say that the numbers don't matter, and you know what, they don't. That'll be interesting. But I'd say probably right now Ian would have to be the favourite, and if he gets across the line, I'd suggest Greg will probably be the favourite for deputy mayor. But I think Jeff Smith's talking about putting his hand up for deputy mayor now after his polling, which is an interesting call for a rookie. I think that's a big call for a rookie, particularly if the mayor happens to get sick or something. He'll be right in the deep end.
I interviewed Jeff yesterday and he didn't mention it, but I guess I didn't put the question straight at him.
No, I heard a bit. I haven't asked him, but I have heard from other media outlets, I guess, that he has mentioned that. But he may be just thinking about it too and testing the waters. I think that'd be a big call for a new guy, but he polled very well. So
polled extremely well.
Yeah.
Obviously recognition goes a long way as well.
Yeah, it does. It does. But where we live doesn't transfer to a mayoral vote or a deputy mayoral vote. And I think he's obviously picked up. Richie's vote had to go somewhere, and the question was whether it was going to get spread out or whether it was going to plonk itself. And it looks like it's not all of it. Richie's vote was bigger than that. But
would you say that Alison Waits and Peter Johnston have perhaps taken some of Richie's vote?
They've definitely shared in some of that. I'd suggest Alison's probably picked up some of the National Party vote. I mean, she's made no. She ran it as an independent, but she's made no secret of the fact that she's a member of the National Party. And
I guess on Peter's defence there, he has run a very solo independent campaign.
100%, yeah. And look, I actually had a talk with him before the election, and he was quite honest with me. He said before we go any further, I want to tell you that I'm in the National Party. He was up front, but I think he's a very, very, how can I put it, maybe a moderate member of the National Party. I think Peter's more about academics and numbers and analytics rather than politics. Yeah. And I think he's going to be a fantastic asset.
It's good to have someone like that on council.
Mate, when it comes budget time or analysing statistics, he'd be your go-to. If you were a councillor, you'd be listening to what he's got to say, I think.
Yeah. And so speaking of the polling and the makeup of council, it looks like it's Tom's is probably in at this stage, and it's a bit of a race between Ellum and Peter Ellum being one of the existing councillors, and the new guy from Almara, Steve Pickering.
Yeah, maybe. Again, I guess the unknown is because there were so few how to vote cards, and the big vote was in Grafton. I'm not sure the Karen's 100% there yet. It just depends where those preferences go. I mean, if they land on Ash Gibbons, she could get in.
Yeah.
So, because there's a lot of votes there to give out.
Do you want to just explain? I'll just give a rundown quickly. So that when I just looked before our meet-up today, the progressive quota at the moment is 2,900, which is what you would need to be automatically on.
Yep.
Jeff Smith with 5,746 and Novak with 3,424, the only two above that. But Tiley, Clancy, Waits, Johnston, Day, I suppose, looking quite comfortable.
Yep.
And then Tom's 1,579, Pickering 1,445, Ellum 1,417, and Gibbons, as you say, a little bit behind there, 1,121.
Yeah.
Do you want to just give a quick explanation of how the preference system works?
Is there such a thing as an explanation of how the preference system works? Look, basically, once someone gets their quota, whatever votes are left, they then distribute the preferences from there. So from that, Jeff's got a lot of votes to give.
So is it all of Jeff's 5,746?
No. The ones that get counted, that get him across the line, don't get counted. So it's only
so there's a bit of luck in terms of some preferences will count in some way.
Absolutely, especially when there's no how to vote card. I mean, how to vote cards obviously are only a guide for people, but people who really want to vote for somebody usually follow them. So if you're on the how to vote card and you're number 2, then you'll usually pick up a lot of those. I mean, I'll make no secret. In fact, in my first term in particular, I picked up a lot of Richies.
Yeah.
2 votes because I was on his how to vote card at 2, and then that got me on council the first time.
So on a federal level and things like that, we see the bottom person will go out and their preferences.
Yeah, that happens too. Yeah, that happens here too. But there's not a lot. I mean, if you have a look at the numbers, there's not a lot of votes to distribute there. So I don't know that they could make the difference because it's very close there at the bottom, particularly between Peter and Steve. But
so do they go top one, then bottom one, then next top one?
Yeah, good question. I'm not 100% sure on that.
I know that Peter Johnson knows.
Peter Johnson's done a really good. If you're interested, jump on on the group. He's done a really good
Greg's
Zoom.
Facebook page.
Zoom, and the video's still there for people to watch. Yeah. But I'm fairly confident what they do though is they'll allocate the preferences from the top first, and once they exhaust, then they start dropping people out.
Yeah.
And move them up, and that's from memory because when I did have to look at it when I was running, but the big ones are going to come from the top, and I think. For Pickering, it'll depend when Clancy gets his quota. You know, if he gets it right at the end, or if he doesn't quite get there, then Pickering won't get much advantage out of his 2 spot.
Yeah.
Jeff had no one except himself at 1. Then he just said number whoever you want. So and I think Deb was the same. So they're the ones that are the unknowns. They could absolutely go anywhere. On trend, they probably go to Peter Johnson and Pickering, but you don't know. I mean that demographic that Jeff had. I don't know. They could go anywhere, and if they land on Ash, like I said, there is a possibility that Karen and Peter Ellum could both miss out. You know, and because there's a lot of votes there.
Yeah,
and it wouldn't be the first time that sort of thing's happened in politics. It's unlikely, though. I think Toms and Pickering will make up the last 2 places. That's my tip. I don't think Peter will pick up enough preferences out of Grafton to get him across the line. But again, I could be completely wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, the work that you and I have both done in our separate platforms has helped a lot of people that are connected online become more informed this election. I've had lots of feedback about that.
Yep.
But evidently the word on the street as well for those people, particularly that aren't on Facebook and things like that. A lot of people didn't even know there was an election until election day.
Yep.
A lot of informals because people just I've got to vote, don't know who to vote for. What would you possibly put that down to?
Well,
I've got my theories.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I think, and that happened in both of my elections as well, but not to the extent that it's happening now. I mean, obviously the fact that we don't have a daily newspaper anymore, and that really does affect, particularly obviously the upper river, more so possibly than the lower river, but definitely up here, Grafton and a lot of the outlying areas. Whilst the weekly papers are doing a pretty good job. It's not the same because you're not getting the flood of information. You're certainly not getting the quantity of information that you can get in a weekly. So I think that's probably a big factor because people were used to the Examiner telling them where to go and where to look.
Yeah.
And now that doesn't exist and they don't know where to turn and where to look. And I think there was a lot of people from out of town, from smaller places like Dundurban and Nimboida, that just said, we've got no one come to visit us, nobody saw us, none of the candidates come to look at us, we have no idea who they are.
Yeah.
And you're right, if they weren't on social media, essentially they were making things up as they went. And they probably voted for the ones they knew, truth be told. There probably is an advantage for the incumbents, I'd suggest, unless they really didn't like them.
So it'd be interesting to see when it's all done and dusted how many, what the deficit was between the number of registered voters and the number of people that actually voted.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the informal votes are about 7.2% now. I think last election was about 6%.
But the number of people that didn't even walk
walk in to vote, yeah. And looking at the numbers now, it looks like it's going to be significant.
Yeah.
If you look at how many votes have been counted, I'm trying to think from memory, but it wasn't even 30,000. I think there's 38,000 registered voters, so it's going to be a big number. And that's a bit of a worry. Particularly for the people who didn't know and missed out, who maybe wanted to vote. But how do you fix that?
Yeah.
That's the question.
I guess, and we live in a time where a lot of people are very, jaded by politics, etc.
Yep.
But I think we're fortunate that this lot of candidates, for those that are aware of who they are, really probably a bit of a refreshing bunch. A lot of people with the right attitude moving forward about the community and things like that. You think that we're in pretty good hands? Well,
it certainly seems that way. From the answers that I saw online on Facebook and also the few that I spoke with, they certainly seem like their heart's in the right place and their intent is the community, regardless of whether they're a member of a party or not. And you know what? The whole time I was on council, I never had an issue with party members voting party lines. I don't think here in the Clarence Valley that's an issue. It might be in the cities, but it's not really here yet, and I hope it stays that way. But no, I think you're right, Bill. I think it's really diverse and a bunch of people, but they seem like they're fairly willing and wanting to get on with each other and work well together. So hopefully it'll happen. I mean, I guess the first test will be the mayoral vote.
Yep.
But look, there's always going to be disagreement. What it comes down to is how they handle that.
Yep.
I used to look at it as the same as a game of footy. You win some, you lose some, and once the game's over, you shake hands and have a beer.
And defeat.
You walk away, and that's the nature of the beast. Hopefully the 9 of them can do that and just put a defeat in their pocket and come back in 2 months, try again, and win everything. Greg Shaney can do that. He's taken quite a few on the chin this term, and he still keeps coming back, and he's still fairly pleasant to pretty much everybody. So that's the type of person that we need, I think, on council.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right, well, thanks for joining us, Craig. It's been a pleasure having a chat with you about dissecting this Clarence Valley Council election. Only, the 20th? 12 more days, we'll have a definite result.
It takes a long time to count preferences, obviously. It'd be nice to have it before that, but that's the time they're working on. So.
But good job, on behalf of the community for the efforts that you've gone to spread the word about the council election and
thanks,
help
mate.
people keep informed.
I find it interesting myself, so it's good.
All right,
Thanks.
cheers.